Hi, I'm Kira Dulaney of Kira Designs, here continuing my pattern collection designed in collaboration with Missouri Star. You've already done the bandana cowl or scarf to get the basics going. Now we're going to put it together into a slightly more complicated row. But the good news is you get to do that row over and over and over. So even if the first pass or two is a bit tricky, you're going to get some pleasant repetition in it. This is the Slalom Stripes blanket. There are two sizes in this one. And the yarn that I'm using here is from Juniper Moon Farms. It's Cumulus, and there's two versions of it. So I've got one of the solids and then one of their gradient cakes. And the fun part about this is that even though it's a big project and it is a little repetitive, it gets really exciting to see the colors changing. So for me, that keeps me much more interested than if I was just doing two solid colors, although you can certainly do that as well. So this is a cotton yarn with just a little bit of nylon, and it's a really interesting construction. The yarn itself is what we call a chain net, which is a knitted tube. Let me get a lighter color so you can see a bit better. So the yarn is actually a teeny tiny knit tube. Those of you who are knitters are going to recognize it as I-cord if you look really closely. And the cool thing with that for crochet, it means it's not going to split. You won't have separate strands that are plied together and can unply and cause you to grab just some of the strands as you're working. It's really hard to poke your crochet hook through this yarn, which is nice. It also gives it a little bit of stretch and bounce, which isn't always true with cotton yarns especially. The fiber doesn't have the same crimp as a wool, and so some cotton yarns can feel a little hard and ropey and be a little trickier on your hands, maybe even cause some fatigue, but this chainette construction is much better for that. So if you're somebody who's tried cotton before, didn't like it, I suggest you give this one a try because it's probably a lot different than what you have worked with in the past. It's also super soft, which is great for a blanket, and easy to care for, which is always nice for cotton. I've also got for tools here a size J crochet hook, and I put on a longer cord. I'm just going to do a sample for today, but when you're doing the blanket, you do want either a long cord or a nice long straight hook. I like the corded ones because then the weight of the project rests more on your lap or on a table as opposed to resting on one wrist the whole time. You may or may not want a stitch marker for this one, especially if you like to stop at the end of a row with just one loop on your hook. A stitch marker can help keep that safe while it's in transit. You will definitely need a yarn needle for the very end, tucking in your yarn tails, and a pair of scissors for when you need them. But this project, we're not going to cut the yarn, even though it's stripes. We're going to keep going and going and going through the colors for minimal finishing. You can get kits for this at the link below or at MissouriQuiltCo.com. All right, let's get started. I'm going to keep this nearby so that you can see it. The thing I mostly want you to notice right now is the chevron that we have this scalloped edge. We're going to be working today just in a simple stitch, so only one stitch, but we're doing a lot of increasing and decreasing to create the pattern. When you increase, you're going to create the hill of the chevron, and when you decrease, you create the valley of the chevron, and we'll also have some plain stitches in between. So if you already did the original project in this series, you've done a bit of this, and now we're going to put it together to a somewhat more complicated row. But the good news is that the return pass stays the same throughout. So I've got my yarn wound up. I'm just using little balls that were left over. I do want to make sure you know that with the gradient yarn, you can work directly from this. And I often like to work from the inside, but you can make that decision based on which color you want to start with as well. With the solid yarns, they come twisted up, and if you undo this twist, it's a big loop. And if you start crocheting with it, you're going to get a giant tangle and think that you don't like this yarn, but it's really just that the yarn isn't prepared. So when you get it, you're going to want to wind it into a ball. And you can do that old school by having somebody hold it out in a loop while you wind it around and around and get a round ball like this. Or you can use a Swift and a ball winder to get a cake of yarn. And I like to work, again, from the inside of these as well. It just doesn't roll around as much on me. But for today, I'm going to work with my little roly-poly balls. Now we're going to start the project with our foundation row. It is the same as the foundation row that we did previously, and a lot of stitches in Hybrid Crochet or Tunisian Crochet start the same way. So at the very beginning, I'm going to do my chain stitch where I make a loop and pull a loop through that and put that on my hook. Now the blanket has two sizes and it's pretty adaptable to different sizes as well if you're trying to do something custom. The numbers are all in there, and I am not going to crochet a blanket for you today because it would take forever. We're going to do a little sample that's going to have 2 of our repeats. So we're going to start with our foundation chain. For the sample, I'm going to do 23 stitches, which will give me 2 repeats plus my edge stitches. So I'm going to chain 23. As always, try to chain them loosely. If you can imagine you could fit 2 hooks in there, that is not too loose. Don't worry too much if it looks messy. I think a little bit messy and functional is better than neat and even and non-functional and so tight you can't even do another row. So go ahead and do 23 and I'll meet you there. So I've done my 23 chain stitches, and I've used some stitch markers to help me keep track of that, especially with a big project like a blanket. They're really helpful. So this way, what I usually do is chain 10, put a marker in the stitch that's right below the working loop on my hook. Then it's going to end up on the next stitch that you make. So the marker would go right below the loop that's on my hook at the moment. And then I would count that 10 and make sure it's really 10. And then I would chain another 10, put a marker in, double check that section. And then when I need a lot, in some projects you need hundreds, I can just go 10, 20, 30, 40, whatever it is. And at the end here, check that I've got the right number afterwards. So here's my last marker, that's at 20, and then I have 1, 2, 3, and then the loop on my hook, which never counts as a stitch itself. It's like the potential to become a stitch. And the way that that really clicked for me is when I realized at the beginning, you make a slip knot. You have not crocheted at all, but you have a loop to start with, and you always have a loop. That's kind of a standard thing that's happening. So I'm now ready to do my foundation row. It'll be the same as the one that we did for the previous project. I like to work in the bumps on the back of my chain, and that makes the top edge and bottom edge of the blanket look the same as each other, which is a nice detail. I'm going to skip the first chain, insert my hook into the bump of the second chain, yarn over and drop a loop. Remember to keep them a little loose, and I'm going to repeat. So I'm going to do this across the row. I'm going to get there and count, and we'll do a return pass. So if you want to meet me there, it'll just take a quick minute. So I finished my forward pass. Always a good idea, especially if you're learning a new stitch, to count your loops. Let's just make sure I've got the 23 I should have. So I've got 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 1, 2, 3. And then I'm ready for my return pass. The return pass is the same for a lot of different stitch patterns, and specifically for the 3 that I chose for this pattern series to give you something a little easy. And I find especially with the blanket where it's a lot of stitches, it's great where half of every row is pretty simple. So the return pass here is going to be a yarn over and draw through 1 loop. And I often like to say when I'm teaching, draw through just 1 loop, just 1 time, to remind people that it only happens at the very beginning. Then I'm going to yarn over and draw through 2 loops repeatedly to get to the end of the row, making sure I keep the loop that's on my hook a little bit loose. And just a reminder, or if you're just starting with this project and didn't do the original one, every row in Hybrid Crochet, which is also called Tunisian Crochet, every row consists of a forward pass where we work from our dominant side to our non-dominant side, picking up loops on our hook, and the return pass where we work back towards our dominant side, working off those loops. So at this point, I have now completed, I'm actually going to pause right here, not quite complete it, 1 row of the project. Even though I went across and back, that still just acts as 1 row. Now here I'm going to pause. I've got 2 loops remaining on my hook, and that's because I need my other color for the next row, and I want to change now to get a really nice color transition. It'll feel better and look better if you change now. So I'm going to take my new color. I usually grab the tail of it and hold it alongside my hook in my dominant hand so that then I can get tension as opposed to just having this dangling and I can't hold on to it very well. And then I'm going to do my final yarn over and draw through 2 loops with my new color. And you might feel like that is a little early, but you can see here I've got my purple row is very distinctly purple, but I have a blue loop on my hook to start the next row. If I waited and changed after this, the purple would come up into the blue row and also it would feel really loose and hard to work with. Now I'm not going to cut the purple. I'm going to use that again on the next row. I'm just going to set it aside. Sometimes I'll even move it to a different side of me so it's more out of my way of my working yarn. Whatever feels comfy for you is fine. Just don't reach for the scissors because then you would have so many yarn tails to weave in. One of the beauties of the gradient yarns is that you get to have a lot of colors without a lot of finishing and yarn tails to work through. I'm ready for my forward pass of row 1, and it's going to feel a little loose because the loop on your hook is connected to this yarn tail. You're welcome to hold that alongside the hook if it helps you just feel like it's a bit more attached. Otherwise, don't worry too much about it. It's going to feel better a couple of stitches in. So the first thing I'm going to do is my make one increase. So I need to rotate my fabric a little bit and find the bump on the back. And it can be a little harder to find on this first stitch. So go ahead and track it down. Honestly, if you don't get the right place, it's probably not going to be a big problem. I'm going to yarn over and draw up a loop. So this is my make one where I've created a new stitch between two existing stitches. And then I've got 3 simple stitches. So the TSS or Tunisian simple stitch, my hook goes in from right to left through the next vertical bar, yarn over and draw up a loop. And again, right to left, next vertical bar, yarn over and draw up a loop. And a third one. At this point, you should have 5 loops on your hook. One you started with, one from the make one increase, and then the 3 simple stitches. And now it's time to decrease, and I'm going to decrease with a TSS 2 together, which stands for Tunisian Simple Stitch 2 together. I'm going to do it twice. So I'm going to insert my hook into the next 2 vertical bars, again just skimming the face of the fabric, and yarn over and draw up a loop. That turns those 2 old stitches into 1 new one. And then I'm going to do that again in the next 2 vertical bars. And that's going to create the valley of our pattern. And you can already see it's starting to curve a little bit on the sample. Now I'm going to do 3 more simple stitches. So into the next stitch, draw up a loop. And I actually find that this can be nice if you're new to the craft because you can see I have all blue loops on my hook. And if I made a mistake, if I had just put my hook into this stitch and not drawn up a loop, it would be really obvious because I have something purple on my hook, which means I'm not done that stitch. So sometimes people think stripes are hard. I actually find they can, in some cases, help orient you to what is this row and what is that row to keep you from making mistakes. So now I'm ready for the hill of my pattern, which is going to be 2 increases. And it's hard to do 2 increases right next to each other like the decreases. So instead we're going to do an increase and then a plain stitch and then an increase. It also creates a pretty pattern on the project. So I'm going to do my make one increase. Again, I'm going to rotate my fabric a little bit to find the bump on the top. It's almost a little bit on the back. A little bit tighter too. Yarn over and draw up a loop there. I've increased 1. Then I'm going to do a simple stitch. And notice how the vertical bar for the simple stitch is very, very close to where you just pulled up a loop. Carefully don't skip that and move on. It's also a good reason for doing a sample swatch. Even if you're not super worried about gauge, you might be worried about running out of yarn, but also gives you a chance to get to know the stitch pattern without lots and lots of loops. So I did my make one increase. I did my simple stitch. I need another make one. So again, I'm going to rotate this a little bit, find that bump on the top, draw up a loop there. And then I'm ready again for 3 simple stitches. That first one is real close. So 1, 2, 3 simple stitches. And then we're already repeating. So the way I kind of count this out in my head is I go from the beginning we had our increase, and then I go 1, 2, 3. Those are my simple stitches. And then decrease, decrease, 1, 2, 3. Increase, we did have to a plain stitch there too. Increase, 1, 2, 3. And having them the same looks nice, but also gives it almost a rhythm as you're crocheting, which is really handy. So now for my decreases, I'm going to do simple stitch 2 together twice. There's 1. Here's a second one. And my 1, 2, 3 simple stitches. These ripple and chevron stitch patterns are made with increases and decreases, but we do need some plain stitches in between. And it also feels good as a crocheter to have a little bit of an easier stitch. Now I'm near the end. I have 1 more actual stitch to go, but I need to do a final make one increase first. So I'm going to find that bump on the top, yarn over and draw up a loop. And then for the final stitch, my preference is to go through 2 loops of it because I find that gives me a neater edge. You can try doing 1 loop and try 2 and see what you prefer. So my final one, I've gone through 2 loops, 2 strands rather of the last stitch, and yarn over and draw up a loop. Now, even though we've increased and we've decreased, we should still have our 23, or for the blanket, the same number you started with your foundation chain. So I'm just going to check to make sure. So I've got 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 23. Now, when you're doing the blanket, if you like to count, it's another time you can use your stitch markers. And there, maybe you'll count up to 20 and stick a marker on your hook. Maybe you'll even do that as you're crocheting it. Do the first section. Check it, put a marker on. Now you know that one's done and you don't have to worry about it. And then do the next section, put a marker on it, check it, and it's easier at the end because you do not want to get to the end of a really long row on something like a blanket and realize you're missing a stitch or you have an extra stitch, I'm also going to show you on the next row how you can look at it visually to line up this row on top of the previous row. So forward pass is done. I'm halfway through my row. I need to do my return pass. It's the same as it was before. So I'm going to yarn over and draw through 1 loop. And then I will repeatedly yarn over and draw through 2 loops. And then we'll meet back with 2 loops on our hook to change color. All right, so here I am almost on my return pass on row 1. I still have 2 blue loops on my hook. I'm going to pause there because it's time to change to my purple yarn. Now, I tend to like to move my balls of yarn around so that I can have the one that I'm working with towards my left, since that's the hand that tensions my yarn, and also just makes me feel neater in the space. I don't have the 2 balls of yarn rolling around and tangling up with each other. So to finish my row 1 return pass, I'm going to switch colors, yarn over with my new color, and draw through my 2 loops. And you can see I've got a blue row with the purple loop on the hook. You'll also see it's starting to create your chevron pattern, which is kind of fun to see that it already has that wiggle going on. Now, I'm going to repeat row 1. Nothing's going to be different about it, except that instead of working into my foundation row, I'm working into the previous pattern row, which actually makes it easier because there are things you can look for to see that everything is lined up. Now, we start with make 1 increase. It can be really hard to find the bump on the back of this first one, especially with the color change that's happening here. So you absolutely have my permission to go in this top strand. It's not exactly a make 1, but it's really subtle and it is a whole lot easier. So feel free to do that on this very first one. And then I'm going to do my 3 simple stitches. And you can always check that then you should have 5 loops on your hook. The one you started with, 1 from the make 1, and then the 3 simple stitches. Now, in my rhythm that's in my head, it is now time to decrease, and I'm just going to take a look at it and make sure it's really time to decrease and things are lined up. So looking at the previous row in the purple, I have my thumbs here on the 2 decreases. You can see 2 strands kind of come up in almost an upside down V shape, and then the blue loop came out of them. This is lined up perfectly because now I'm going to decrease these 2 stitches, and then I'll decrease those 2 stitches. So the space in between the decreases is perfectly lined up. I'm going to do that and then show you what it looks like. So here's my simple stitch 2 together, twice. And you can see there's like a little gap almost, not a big hole, but just a little space, and you can see that things are lined up really nicely. We'll do the same with our increases. But first I've got 3 simple stitches. So now it's time for me to make 1 increase and then 1 simple stitch and a make 1 increase. And you can see here how I've got this nice vertical line. My simple stitch that's in the middle is going to extend that vertical line. It's another way for me to make sure I'm in the right place. So for my make 1, I'm going to look at the back, find that bump. It's always a little tighter. Yarn over and drop a loop. And then I've got my simple stitch, which is right near it. And then my other make 1. And here again, we've got something that lines up vertically so you can see that everything's in the right place. I'm going to pull over the blanket here just so you can see up close how that works. So this line here, these are my decreases. The decrease, decrease, and there's that little gap in between. I actually think it's kind of a pretty detail. And then you also can see this vertical line here, which is the increases. And I like to see that those are lining up in my row, especially if I have a big long row for the blanket, to make sure that everything's in place and I'm not going to get to the end and be a little bit off on my stitch count. I'm now ready for my 3 plain stitches. So simple stitch, 1, 2, 3. Time for my decrease. I'm just going to check of the 2 stitches I'm going to decrease together, the second one is on top of the first decrease from last time, so that is perfectly placed. So simple stitch 2 together, simple stitch 2 together, and I've got my 1, 2, 3. And I want to warn you, when you get this close to the end, it's really easy to just do the last stitch because that's what you're used to in other projects, but we do really need that make 1 increase here. Now, if you forget it, you're going to count your stitches anyway, at least for the first few rows, and you will notice it, and it's a mistake that just happened. The end of the row is the best place to make a mistake. The beginning of the row is a really frustrating place to make a mistake. But just slow yourself down a little bit as you get to the end, and remember there is one more make 1 before that final stitch. So here's my final make 1, and then my last stitch. Again, I like to go into those 2 strands. You can count your stitches, make sure that you've got your 23 for this case, or the blanket, depending on the size, you'll have a different number of stitches, Eventually you might not count, but at least for the first few rows of your swatch, it is not a bad idea to make sure. Then our return pass will be the same as usual. When I'm down to 2 loops, I'll switch colors, and I'm going to keep doing that over and over and over again. Now I want to give you a couple of tips and also talk a bit about playing with color, because this is a great project to do that. So on the blanket, and this is the baby blanket size, there's also a throw blanket size as well, I needed more than one of my gradient skeins. So I just got started. I picked my color. I actually on purpose started with the ones that have a higher contrast in value. My solid colors are light, and so rather than starting with a light, which is kind of a bright yellow on the inside here, I started with a dark purple so I could see the stitches and see the rows, and also so that you can see the stitches and see the rows when you're doing it. And eventually I ran out of my gradient yarn, and that was in the middle, since this particular project takes 2 of each color. And rather than starting with the purple again, I started with the yellow. So I finished the yellow, my first gradient, and then started the yellow on the second one. So I get this smooth transition. Had I started with purple, there would have been a really harsh change, where it changed from the bright yellow to the dark purple, and that would have been a little glaring to my eyes. This also means that for this particular project, you've got nice symmetric edges. When you fold it, the 2 purple edges are together, which is kind of nice as well. So let's actually talk about color for a minute, because this is a great time to play with color. I chose a pretty bright color combination because I like bright stuff in general, but also for babies, and I have trouble resisting a rainbow. But I've got another sample here that would be a very different look for the blanket. So we have a little bit more of a neutral gradient, and if you're really gentle, you always peek at the inside of a gradient, because it looks like there's almost none of this color when it's just naturally in here, but it's going to be the same amount as the other color at the opposite end. Some yarn companies even wind their gradients at half of the balls. They wind the opposite direction to help people realize what that inside color is. So here I've got something that's a bit more neutral. So we've got the grays, I've got kind of a rose color, and it goes into a little bit of a almost an olivey green into this orangey color. It has more color than you think looking at just the outside, and it's been paired here as a suggestion with a neutral. But I could also pair this gray neutral, and I thought about doing this exact color combination with the rainbow, and that looks kind of awesome too. I'm not sure I would pair these, but it'd be worth swatching, because sometimes it's surprising what's going to go well together. Of course, we'll have some kits that give you different ideas of colors that you can do, but it's also fun to play around and see what you might be interested in. When I was on the newer side, I used to work a lot. I actually used to work a lot with black, because I wore black and I had very young eyes and it wasn't that hard to see. And then I did a lot of gray because I knew I'd wear gray. But it's kind of nice now to get into wearing some brighter stuff. And I probably wouldn't have picked up a sweater in this nice bright green color at a store, but I dyed the yarn, and the yarn was fun, and I wanted to use the yarn that I dyed, so it made sense to make a thing with it. And now I wear it all the time and get a lot of compliments on it, because it's bright and colorful and cheerful. So for the blanket, you're going to keep doing that same row. It's row 1 over and over and over and over. I hope that the gradient yarn helps keep you interested in doing it and keeps it from getting boring. At the very end, though, we're going to need to do our finishing row. So I've got a sample here. Got a little tangled. That's a danger with the cords. They sometimes get tangled in your yarn. I've got a sample here, and I have just finished, almost finished, the final row with my solid color yarn. I'm about to work with a gradient yarn. I haven't crocheted enough for you to see the gradient actually happening, but it is the one that's purple that's going to transition through the rainbow into yellow. I like to start with the same colors I ended, so since I started with that, I'm going to end with it. And so to finish my row here, I'm going to do a yarn over and draw through those final 2 loops so that I have this color on the hook. And the finishing row is going to be similar to what we did with the previous project. I'm going to work single crochet, inserting my hook as for a Tunisian knit stitch, which means rather than going through the bar, I go into the loop straight through to the back. And let me do that again. I'm actually going to do this one quickly. I'm going to do the next one slower so you'll be able to see the next one better. This one, since it's got the make one, it's a little harder to see the angle. So I've drawn up a loop, and I'll yarn over and draw through both loops. And then I'm going into my next loop that's over here, into that loop, yarn over and draw up a loop, yarn over and draw through both. Check yourself after a little while, because once you've done a whole blanket, you are very likely to want to get a lot of loops on your hook. Here, 2 is the most you'll have halfway through a stitch, and every time a stitch is resolved, you should be down to 1. So we'll single crochet all the way across. I usually on this row don't bother with increasing and decreasing. Some people do like to do it. I find it's not necessary to keep the chevron shape, and it gets a little messy to have those increases or decreases right at the edge. It also kind of mirrors our original foundation row. We didn't increase on that or decrease on that. It is possible to, but again, I find you don't need to, and it makes the edge look a little bit neater. So you can see here I've got, doesn't look quite the same as the other edge, but we at least are mirroring the colors. And as usual, it didn't look great before I did the finishing row. This really does kind of cap it off and fill in those gaps in a nice way for a nice clean finish. The other thing to be careful of is that you don't start working tight, because a lot of people do. When they're on that finishing row, they just grip a little harder. Maybe they're racing to get it done. But if it's tight, you'll get an edge that has less stretch, that maybe even pulls in and puckers your fabric, which you definitely don't want to do. Oh, and actually I want to show this. I just poked through my yarn. I mentioned at the beginning, it is hard to do that with this chainette style yarn. It is still possible. So I'm just going to undo that stitch and do it again. I sometimes even get my hands in here and kind of get that stray strand out of the way. And as usual, on the final stitch of the row, including on this finishing row, I like to go under 2 strands at the edge, because I find that gives me a really nice clean finish. And then we're going to take my scissors. You don't need a long tail for this, just enough to weave in, and draw through that final loop to tie it off. Now, as with pretty much every project, in my opinion, you're going to want to block this. Because blocking is going to smooth things out. You can kind of see on the table, it's a little bit textured and 3-dimensional. That's not shocking, because increases and decreases shape things. It gets smaller here and bigger here, so I'm not shocked that this kind of poking up over there. Why don't we just go ahead and do some blocking together? I'm going to get some water and a blocking mat, and I'll show you the process. It's pretty quick and easy, but that way you won't be worried about it. All right, so before we block, we're going to weave in our yarn tails, and I've got one here to show you. I like to weave in the tails on the wrong side of the work. And I'm going to start by putting my needle in, not exactly where the yarn came out, but somewhere that's pretty close. And insert the needle. I like to go in about a 45-degree angle if I can. It really depends on the stitch, but this one I can really nicely. About 1/2 inch or so. Check that the needle's covered up on this side so you don't see big flashes of needle. And also it doesn't go through to the other side. It should be invisible on the other side. Pull that through gently. You don't need to pull tight. Just go till there's no extra. And then I like to turn it and come back right next to it. You can go on either side. Maybe this side feels easier. Doesn't really matter. But the turn really helps keep it from coming out, especially for something like a blanket that hopefully you're going to have in your family for a lot of years, and it'll get washed a lot. You want to make sure this tail is buried. 2 passes is often fine, but if you're feeling a little nervous, or if you really just know this is going to be an heirloom and kept for a long, long time, go ahead and do a 3rd pass. It can't hurt, and if it makes you feel more confident, it's worth that extra 2 seconds. And then if there's any extra, I just cut off whatever's still there. You don't have to weave in your ends before you block, but it can be nice to do. I'm just going to give it a little bath. So this is just some regular water. If you know this got grimy, you can certainly put a bit of soap in, but really what we want here is for it to get wet. And if it's floating, I'm going to leave it for a minute, maybe flip it over or squish it so it really gets wet inside the stitches, inside the center of the yarn, so everything's completely saturated. Just spritzing with water isn't going to do a good enough job of blocking. We want to get it real wet. And then we're going to get it pretty dry. So I'm going to set up my blocking mat. I just need a little one here because I just did a little swatch, and squish out the water. I sometimes will roll it up in a towel or a paper towel, just get out more of the water. That'll help it block and dry faster, because I am usually really eager to get the thing. To photograph it, to use it, to wear it, whatever that is. So we got it really wet, and now we've got it pretty dry. It's definitely still damp, but it's not super saturated anymore. And I'm going to wiggle it into position. So what I usually do here is pull a little bit so that my chevrons a little bit more, and then I'll smooth out the edges. For a project like this, you don't necessarily have to pin it in place, but if you do have like a corner that's really flipping up, you could certainly pin that. You definitely want to use a pin that is stainless steel. You do not want to use a thumbtack and get it rusty. I know because I've seen people do that and get really sad when they have rust stains forever and ever on their project. Now, with the chevron, I usually don't find a whole lot of curl to the fabric, but if you do find that all of your little scallop points are curling upwards, go ahead and just block it upside down, and then the tension of the fabric against the blocking mat is going to help. And if you need to pin a corner, you can certainly pin a corner. But this is not a project where I want you to pull it and block it under tension. You just don't need that here. We mostly want to smooth things out, make sure our chevron is pointy and our edges are pretty flat. And then you're going to leave that till it's dry, and then you've got a finished blanket. And if you enjoyed the project, you can certainly pick out a different set of colors and make another one. You can get all of the kits at the link below or at MissouriQuiltCo.com. And I hope you had fun with this project. Happy crocheting. I'll see you for the next episode.
Thanks so much for stitching along with us on this Missouri Star yarn loving tutorial. If you haven't yet, you want to click that bell and subscribe and become part of the Missouri Star family and make sure that you never miss another tutorial. You never know, you might make your next favorite project.